What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Iron Chapel educational series on hypertrophy training. Today is episode 2, and we're talking about pull day. So that's back and bicep exercises, and we're going to talk about the rear delts a bit as well, how to implement that into your training. So let's get started. So I'll quickly go over the preface again. If you want to hear the entire thing and the explanation of what I'm going to talk about, go check out the first video of this series. It's the push day principles, and that's a good video overall to check out as well. So muscles should be trained according to muscle fiber type. So we're going to be talking about the type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers as we get into each individual muscle. Muscles should be trained in stretch and contracted positions. Also, the muscles fatigue in the contracted position first, so these positions should be exhausted earlier in a session and earlier in an exercise. So there's 3 main ways to grow a muscle. Mechanical tension is going to be your main way. That's heavy controlled reps on the eccentric and muscle fiber damage that happens on that eccentric when you're controlling the weight. Metabolic pressure is going to be time under tension in your pumps, expanding the muscle and creating more room for more muscle to build. Progressive overload is going to be increasing total volume and total intensity over time with the weight that you use, assuming that your reps are consistent with form and tempo. And in the first video as well, I talk about the effective reps principle, which is something that's also important. I would definitely check that one out and learn more about that as well. So we're going to start by talking about the back because this is the pull day episode. So we're going to start with the lats. The lats are an equal split of type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. So you should start with heavier training and finish with a lighter stretch with lighter weight. So the origins of the back are from the mid back down to the lower back fascia. And the insertions are on the anterior side of the humerus, and it wraps down the medial side of the humerus. And that's actually a big misconception. People think it just attaches on the bottom of the humerus and pulls straight down, but it wraps around and attaches on the top, which allows the lats to assist in internal rotation, which I'll talk about in a moment as well. The lats are capable of many different pulling motions, which will bias different fibers, but proper form with a strong scapular depression, which means bringing the scapula down towards your hips and keeping it there, will allow all the fibers to stay very active regardless of the angle that you're pulling in. So the lats, as I mentioned, assist in internal rotation of the shoulder. So the max contraction will be when the humerus is squeezed in at the side and slightly internally rotated while depressing the scapula as well. The max stretch that you can achieve with the lats is going to be performed with the arm overhead being pulled back with slight external rotation. A stiff core and a flexed upper back, it will assist with this stretch to avoid compensation from the spine, because often when you're stretching the lats, tight lats will force the upper back into extension, which takes the stretch off of the lats. Some key exercises for the lats are going to be your rows. So we're going to talk about rows that are in a pulling motion perpendicular to the body. You're going to pull the weight towards your chest or the abdomen. The lower down on your body will allow for more lat activation as opposed to upper back. So rows are a good starter for the back as well because their max tension is at the max contraction position of the lats. So that's going to exhaust that position first earlier in the workout. Rows can be done with a barbell, dumbbell, cables, machines. There's many different options for these. The angle of the body can be changed to bias different parts of the lat, but should remain consistent throughout the sets. So for example, if you're doing barbell rows, you should not be angling your body more upward towards the end of the set or towards later sets. You should keep it as consistent as you possibly can. Your arm angle will also be changed to bias different muscles of the back. So for the lats, like I said, you're pulling the bar more towards your stomach or your hips, and your arms should be tucked into the sides of the body. The option between barbell or dumbbell depends mostly on personal preference. Personally, I like barbell better. I feel it better in my lats, even though my right side tends to take over more, but I very much work on focusing on that left side, as should anybody that's going to be doing motions like this. Cables may be unstable to perform for some individuals if done standing, but certain seated positions can make the exercise better. And for machines, some of the machines are great and they'll have a good plane of motion and have adjustable resistance profiles, but also with these you got to be careful because some of them are just not that great. So pronation and supination of the hand also depends on personal preference. Pronation activates more the brachialis, which we'll talk about later as well when we talk about the biceps, and supination will activate more of the biceps. Supination also allows for better contraction of the lats because of that wrist position. It forces the humerus to be more tucked in towards the side. Scapular retraction is optional, although most people will feel a better contraction of the lats with a retraction of the scapula during the rep. So that means just bringing the scapula towards the spine during your reps, but the scapula should also remain depressed throughout whether you retract the scapula or not. I highly recommend scapular retraction because you're also going to be hitting the lower traps and mid traps at the same time as you're hitting your lats while not taking away from the lats at all. So I think that's just a no-brainer to perform that. Non-supported rows and deadlifts also require demands from the core and the spinal erectors. The spinal erectors will not need isolation for most people. For those who require isolation here can perform back extensions, rack pulls, RDLs to hit these muscles. I pair work on these muscles with the legs more than the back because of the increased demand when paired with the posterior chain. So moving on now to lat pull downs. Pull downs or pull-ups can be done on a bar as a pull-up or with cables or machines as a pull-down. Pull-ups may be harder for heavier or weaker people if they cannot pull their own body weight. They also require more involvement of the core to stiffen the body and keep the motion efficient. Just a quick thing here with kipping pull-ups, I shouldn't even have to mention this, but kipping pull-ups are not effective for building muscle. If you look back at the preface in the beginning of the video, we said that the eccentric part of the motion where you're tearing the muscle and creating damage is going to be the biggest part for building the muscle. So these kipping pull-ups are not going to build muscle very efficiently. Cable pull-downs and machines isolate the lats a lot further than most pull-ups or kipping pull-ups. The teres major is a smaller muscle which can take over for the lats if the scapula is not properly depressed. For physique competitors, this muscle is not very visible because it's very small, so it does not need extra work than it gets with proper pulls for most people. Isolation of this muscle is just not very important for majority of people in general, so I wouldn't worry about it much at all. Pull downs will work primarily in the mid-range of the lat contraction because that is when the humerus is perpendicular to the resistance, which is going to be straight vertical. Pullovers, now with a straight arm, can be done with a cable or a dumbbell. Dumbbells will allow a better stretch on the muscle, but may sacrifice mind-to-muscle connection, which personally it's not very important this late in the session because these are going to be used to finish your session because you're getting more of a stretch with the weight, but the mind-to-muscle connection that late in the session isn't going to be great anyway because you're exhausted. So cable pullovers can be performed with a rocking motion of the body by leaning in towards the cable as you go back up to get a good stretch, to keep the cable more perpendicular to the arms to keep a more consistent resistance profile in the muscle. So traps, the upper and lower traps, some people count a middle section as well, but I just consider mostly upper and lower because the lower traps are going to perform more retraction and depression while the upper traps are going to perform elevation. So 80% of the traps is type 1 fibers, so this can be very confusing for many people because type 1 fibers usually means you want to train lighter weight for more endurance because that's what type 1 fibers are for. But the traps are able to contract under relatively heavy weight for long periods of time because of their leverage. So you still should be using heavier weight to train the traps than you would think. So the traps are also very responsive to intense stretching under load while contracting the weight as well. So this basically means heavy deadlifts, heavy rack pulls, cleans, stuff like that put a lot of force on the muscle. They're contracting in that stretch position, and they're very responsive to grow under that stimulus. The origin of the traps are along the spine from the mid-back to the back of the skull, and the insertion points are all around the scapula, from the top of the scapula all the way down to the bottom where the lower traps connect. The traps pull in many directions, so should be trained as such for complete development. Traps are responsible for elevation, retraction, depression of the scapula. Like I mentioned a few times before, there's more movements that the scapula can undergo, but those are the ones that the traps go under and are more relevant to this. So some key exercises for the traps. Like I said, personally, I like to train traps different than most people do. You could do your basic shrugs and your rows and stuff like that to hit the traps, but I think the best way to hit your traps, they'll get more sore from this kind of stuff. They'll get more stimulus because it's heavy weight and you're also putting them through endurance. But the best things that I think are for traps are the Olympic lifts. The Olympic lifts and accessories have high demands on the traps because the traps can hold great weight and are very effective in the stretch position while isometrically contracted. These explosive movements put a lot of dynamic pressure on the traps. So that means as you pull, it's going to be much heavier than towards the top. So they're constantly being under different forces, so they're forced to grow. Wide grip rows are another great exercise for the traps. These are more normal for most people, but rows with a wide grip primarily pull with the traps and the rear delts. Because of the increased leverage from the humerus at the contracted position of the row, the traps are greatly compromised and cannot hold nearly as much weight because of that leverage. So the rear delts are also very active in this exercise. The rear delts can be also grown using dumbbell or the cable rear flies. So moving on to the biceps have a long head and a short head. The long head originates at the top of the humerus, and the short head originates within the shoulder and is affected by the angle of the humerus. They both converge to insert across the elbow on the forearm. So that's something that's very confusing, and when I figured out about the heads of the biceps a while ago, I was like, that makes no sense. The long head is actually shorter and the short head is actually longer, which doesn't make sense, but the biceps motion is to flex the elbow mainly, but also to supinate the wrist. So that means rotating outwards, and as you curl, you rotate the wrist to face up. So these motions should be combined in most of their training. The brachialis is also a muscle of the arm. Brachialis is a muscle that lies underneath the bicep. So motions of the brachialis include flexion of the elbow, primarily when the wrist is neutral, or in a pronated when the bicep has the least amount of leverage. The bicep and brachialis are mostly fast twitch muscle fibers, so that's your type 2 muscle fibers, and should be trained heavy with some light exhaustion work as well because they're a combination. Because the biceps are strongest in the mid-range, they should be trained mostly with the humerus parallel to the pulling motion. The angle of the shoulder can be changed to further exhaust the short head through more ranges because it crosses the shoulder joint. So some key exercises for the biceps are going to be spider curls. Spider curls with free weights keep the weight heaviest at the biceps strongest point, but also allow the short head to achieve a full contraction because of the angle of the shoulder. These should be performed early in the workout to exhaust the muscle at the fully contracted position of the biceps. Incline curls are going to be another one to exhaust the muscle in the stretch position with lighter weight. These work same as spider curls and should be trained towards the end. It's the inverse of the spider curls training in the stretch position as opposed to the contraction. And these will help fully exhaust the short head in its stretch position. These should be performed with full pronation and extension at the elbow at the bottom of the motion to fully stretch the biceps between each rep. So the biceps with the long head, which does not cross the shoulder joint, these are going to be equally active no matter what bicep movement you're doing. So I wouldn't worry about trying to isolate those much at all. So that's my take on the pull day. there's some great exercises in there that you guys should definitely give a try, and definitely try some different stuff out for the traps if you're hitting a plateau with those. So remember, ironchapel.net, we offer coaching using these principles if you're in a hypertrophy cycle. We also train for sports and powerlifting. Right now I'm in a powerlifting prep, so that goes perfectly with our competition season that we're getting into. So you're going to be, if you're hopping on that type of training, you're going to be seeing a lot of videos about that come the new year when we start our strength training. So also merchandise and Swoley Resurrection pre-workout available on the website as well. Definitely go give that one a check out. And hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and got something good out of it. Up next week is going to be the leg day, and that will conclude our 3-part series. I'm probably also going to put in a video about balancing volume and intensity for different people and different goals. So definitely keep an eye out for that later in November. But hopefully you guys got something out of this video or found it entertainment. We'll see you again next time for leg day principles.